years old and have been working as a police officer for over a decade in Lexington County, South Carolina. I'm not a rookie, and I'm not the type who sees things everywhere. At that time, I had been on the night shift for a few weeks because a colleague went on leave and I picked up the schedule to help out. It was a pretty normal Wednesday, nothing much happening. The kind of humid weather we always get around here, and I was already thinking more about finishing my patrol than about any serious call. When dispatch pulled over the radio, an automatic 911 call from a street in a new neighborhood, the kind full of identical houses and perfect lawns, I just thought, alarm, kid messing with the phone, ghost call. The address came with a strange note. Property officially vacant, for sale. No registered residents, no internet service, only a landline. These automatic calls usually come from alarm systems or some old phone with a line issue. Still, procedure is to go, check, and clear. I arrived in less than 8 minutes. The neighborhood looked like a set piece. Wide street, no cars parked, neatly aligned porch lights, and that kind of silence that isn't small-town quiet. It's the silence of a place where almost no one lives yet. The house was one of those new 2-story builds, light-colored facade, large front window, for sale sign on the lawn. Nothing was broken. Doors and windows closed, no glass on the ground. Nothing that looked like a break-in. The only thing out of the ordinary was the physical sensation of being watched as soon as I stepped out of the cruiser. I won't say my instinct screamed or anything dramatic, but I felt the back of my neck heat up and I became more alert. The porch light was off and the whole house was dark, which made sense for a vacant property. But there was a very faint glow coming through the curtains, as if someone had left a small gap on purpose. I announced police loudly, knocked on the door, waited. Nothing. The realtor lockbox was mounted on the side and dispatch confirmed I had authorization to enter, so I used the code they provided. When I opened the door, the first thing that caught my attention was the smell. It wasn't strong mold or rot. It was that closed house smell mixed with dry paint and new wood, but with a faint metallic undertone like old dust. My flashlight beam cut across the living room and showed everything too clean, too organized. Light flooring, white walls, no furniture, except for a single chair in the middle of the room positioned exactly facing the front door. It wasn't against the wall. It wasn't knocked over. It wasn't tossed aside. It was aligned as if someone had been sitting there waiting. I stood still for a few seconds just looking at it, trying to rationalize. It could have been old staging from the realtor, maybe something left over from a showing. Except the rest of the house was completely empty. Even the marks on the floor showed there hadn't been a couch, no table, nothing. And the strangest part, you could see a thin layer of dust on the floor near the walls. But around the chair, the floor looked slightly cleaner. I called for routine backup over the radio. Nothing urgent, just standard for entering a vacant property. My partner that night, Daniels, arrived a few minutes later. In the meantime, I walked into the kitchen right off the living room. The counter was clean, nothing on top, but there was a white landline phone mounted on the wall. Dispatch had already informed us the call originated from that line. The receiver was on the hook, perfectly seated. No loose cord, no sign it had been ripped out. I lifted it to check for dial tone and there was one. Normal. No visible redial, no blinking lights. The dust on the base was light, but around the buttons it seemed slightly less accumulated, as if someone had recently touched it. No clear fingerprint, but that subtle difference you only notice when you're actively looking for something wrong. Daniels walked in and the first thing he said was, "Who put that chair there?" I told him I wanted to know the same thing. We started a standard sweep of the ground floor, opening each door slowly, announcing presence, checking closets and the small bathroom near the stairs. Nothing out of place, nothing disturbed, no windows open. The house was too silent. No normal wood creaks, no air slipping through cracks. It was a heavy silence that made any small sound seem too loud. When I passed through the living room again toward the stairs, I had the impression that the chair was slightly closer to the door than before. It could have been my mind, a different angle of perspective, but it stuck with me. I stopped and looked carefully at the legs. No obvious drag marks, but I couldn't rule out that they had been wiped away. Daniels noticed I had paused and asked what was wrong. I just said nothing, that we should go upstairs and finish it. The staircase was to the right of the entrance, light carpet, wooden railing still shining like new. As we went up, I felt the air grow slightly more stuffy. as if the second floor was warmer than downstairs. Not extreme, but noticeable. My flashlight illuminated the hallway at the top of the stairs, and that's where the second truly wrong thing appeared. All the bedroom doors were closed. Not ajar, closed. Daniels immediately commented that it was strange because he had seen the listing photos weeks earlier when the house hit the market, and all the doors had been open to show the rooms. It might sound like a small detail, but in a vacant property, interior doors are usually left open. I tested the first handle slowly, expecting resistance, expecting any sound from the other side. Nothing. Just the dry click of the latch. I opened the first door slowly, flashlight at chest height, weapon low but ready. The room was completely empty. Carpet intact, window closed, blinds down. Streetlight filtering in faintly through the slats. No one behind the door. No one in the closet. No one in the bathroom. But the air inside felt different. Warmer and with a faint smell of old sweat, like someone had been in there for a while. Not strong enough to confirm anything, but different from the rest of the house. I felt that automatic physical response. Slightly faster heartbeat, shorter breaths. Daniel stepped in behind me and said the room also felt too warm for an empty house. I closed the door again, not out of necessity, but almost by impulse, as if leaving it open would be worse. We moved to the second bedroom. Same thing. Closed door, cold handle, absolute silence behind it. When I turned the knob, I heard a faint sound from the end of the hallway. Not loud, like a quick crack, like wood shifting under weight. I froze immediately and raised my hand for Daniels to stay quiet. We stood still for a few seconds, just listening. Nothing afterward. No footsteps, no breathing, no movement. I opened the second bedroom quickly this time, trying to catch anyone off guard. Empty again. But there was something on the carpet near the window. Faint marks, as if someone had been kneeling there recently. The carpet was slightly indented, different from the rest of the floor, which was uniform. I placed my hand on it. It was still warm. Not hot, but not completely cold like the rest of the room. A chill ran up my arm when I realized it truly was slightly warmer there. Not my imagination. I stayed kneeling for a few seconds, pressing my palm against different areas of the floor to compare. The rest of the room was cold, as expected in a closed house at night. That specific area had retained recent heat. Daniels looked at me with that expression that mixes doubt and concern, but neither of us wanted to say out loud what we were thinking. If someone had been there minutes before, that person could still be inside the house. I stood up slowly and signaled for him to cover the hallway while I stepped out of the room. My body was tense in a way it isn't during a normal call. It was that silent tension where any noise feels like a trigger. Only the last door at the end of the hallway remained. It was closed like the others, but unlike them, there was a darker shadow at the bottom, as if interior light was being blocked by something right behind it. I positioned myself against the wall, took a breath, and slowly turned the handle. Before I even opened it fully, I felt a shift in the air like displacement. The door opened to reveal the master bedroom, also empty at first glance. No bed, no furniture. But the window was slightly open, just a few centimeters. The others had all been closed. The curtain moved almost imperceptibly with the wind. Daniels went straight to it and looked outside. The backyard led to a small patch of woods, and beyond that another empty lot. No one visible. But the dirt right below the window looked slightly disturbed, as if someone had braced their feet there to climb up or down. When I approached the window, I felt the night air coming in, damp and cool compared to the rest of the house. The temperature difference was clear now. If that window had been open for long, the whole room would have been colder. But only that strip near the window was affected. I shined my flashlight on the ground outside and saw more defined marks in the soft dirt, like partial shoe impressions. Not perfect, but recent enough not to have been erased by wind. What bothered me was noticing the marks went in two directions. Some seemed to move away from the house, but others came toward the window. As if someone had left or returned. Daniels said my name in a lower tone than usual. When I turned, he was staring fixedly at the hallway. The chair. It was no longer in the middle of the living room. From the master bedroom doorway, you could see part of the living room downstairs, and the chair was now positioned near the base of the stairs, slightly tilted to one side, as if it had been moved in a hurry. Neither of us had gone downstairs. Neither of us had touched it since entering. My stomach literally dropped in that moment. It wasn't cinematic fear. It was that dry sensation where your mouth loses saliva and heat rises in your chest. The house was too silent again. No sound of a door, no running footsteps, nothing. Just the distant sound of a car passing on the main neighborhood road. I looked at Daniels and saw he was pale. He didn't need to confirm it. We had both seen the chair in the middle of the room when we went upstairs. At that moment, the procedure changed completely in my head. Until then, it could have been a trespasser who had already left. It could have been a strange coincidence. But something had moved inside the house while both of us were on the second floor. That wasn't interpretation. I felt my heart beat harder in that rush of adrenaline that makes your ears feel muffled. I signaled for Daniels to come downstairs with me slowly, without unnecessary noise. Each step on the carpet felt too loud even though it was soft. I expected to hear someone running, a door slamming, anything. Nothing came. When we reached the last step, the entire living room was visible. The chair was definitely different. Not only closer to the stairs, but slightly turned upward, as if positioned to face whoever came down. I felt something I rarely feel on duty. The clear sensation of being watched from a specific point. My eyes went straight to the space under the stairs. It was enclosed by drywall, but there was a small access hatch, common in new houses. It was slightly open, about 2 fingers wide. I am absolutely certain that was closed when we entered, because I automatically scanned those points. The gap was too dark to see inside. No light coming out. Just a stronger smell of stale air, almost like trapped breath. Daniels whispered that he didn't like it. Neither did I. I positioned myself beside the opening, and before touching the hatch, I heard a very faint sound from inside. It wasn't a growl, nothing dramatic. It was the clear sound of someone shifting their body weight. I didn't think twice. I pushed the hatch open with my foot and aimed my flashlight straight inside. The beam cut through the tight space under the stairs and first illuminated dust in the air, then a pair of dirty sneakers curled in the corner. The person was there, crouched, knees to chest. A thin man, patchy beard, dark clothes, dirty with soil. He blinked several times under the light, as if he had been in the dark for some time. For a second, no one spoke. I could hear my own breathing inside my vest, too loud. Daniels gave the clear command for him to show his hands. He slowly raised them, hands trembling, eyes red as if he hadn't slept. The smell in there was stronger. Accumulated sweat and closed air. No visible weapon, but it was clear he was sweating even with the cool air coming in from the still open front door. We pulled him out and cuffed him without resistance. He didn't try to run, didn't try to fight. He just kept repeating quietly that no one was believing him. When I asked who he was and what he was doing there, he said the house wasn't empty, that someone had been living there before he arrived. He said he called 911 because they were inside the walls. I asked who they were and he just shook his head. He said he heard footsteps when he was alone, and that the chair needed to face the door so he wouldn't be caught off guard. That gave me a different kind of chill. The chair. He admitted he had moved it. He said he went upstairs when he heard us enter and hid under the stairs because he thought they had come back. But there was one thing that didn't add up. Dispatch later confirmed the 911 call was made exactly 4 minutes before our arrival, and he was sweating like someone who had just run, not like someone who had been hiding there for a long time. Story 2. I am 41 years old and I've been a deputy in rural Nebraska for almost 15 years. My job is basically patrolling country roads, farms, and small towns where everyone knows each other. The overnight shift is usually quiet. An animal on the road, a broken down pickup, a teenager messing around near an abandoned silo. That specific night I was alone in the north sector of the county, which is basically agricultural roads surrounded by corn and nothing else. It was a little after 3 a.m., completely clear sky, no wind, low temperature with that dry chill that makes the air feel thin. I was finishing a routine patrol when I saw headlights on along the shoulder of a secondary dirt road. It wasn't common to see a car there at that hour. That road practically dies after 10 p.m. At first I thought it might be a farmer heading out early, but as I got closer I realized something was wrong. The car was parked slightly crooked on the shoulder, engine running, headlights on, pointed toward the cornfield on the right side of the road. The driver's door was open. Not wide open, but enough for the interior light to be on. No one was in the seat. I parked my cruiser about 10 meters behind it and immediately felt that strange sensation in my stomach. It wasn't fear yet, more like a physical alert. I illuminated the interior with my high beams before stepping out. Nothing moved. As I approached, I could hear the engine running steadily like it had been left on recently. Inside the car, there was a wallet on the passenger seat, a cell phone in the center console, and the keys in the ignition. No sign of collision, no broken glass, no blood. Just empty, and the road completely silent around it. I turned off the engine first, more out of reflex than anything else. The noise stopped and the rural silence became even more noticeable. It was that kind of silence where you can hear your own uniform brushing when you move. I picked up the wallet and checked the ID. The name was Daniel Hargrove, 27 years old, resident of a town about 25 minutes away. Nothing indicated he had any problematic history. The cell phone was unlocked, screen still on with a map app open but no active route. No ongoing call, no recently opened message. I walked around the car with my flashlight. The dirt on the shoulder was soft enough to hold footprints, and there they were. A single set coming from the driver's side and heading straight into the cornfield. There were no signs of another person around the vehicle. I notified dispatch that I had a possible suspicious abandonment and asked them to log the exact time. Then I began following the footprints. The corn was already tall that time of year, almost shoulder height. Entering a field like that in the middle of the night isn't pleasant. Visibility drops significantly, and sound becomes strange, muffled. Each step I took made the dry leaves scrape against my uniform. The footprints were clear for the first few meters, deep impressions in the soft soil between the rows. They looked like someone walking quickly, but not running. About 10, maybe 15 meters into the field, the prints became lighter, and then they stopped. There was no mark of a fall, no sign of turning back, no side mark. They just stopped. I shined my light around, expecting to see them continue in another direction. Nothing. The ground there was firmer, but it still should have shown some sign. It didn't. I stood there for a few seconds trying to rationalize it. Maybe he turned onto more compact soil. Maybe he stepped exactly in his own prints. Maybe he moved sideways between the rows. I began circling the spot where the footprints ended, shining my light carefully, searching for the smallest sign of continuation. Nothing. Just firm soil and plants barely moving because there was no wind. That's when my radio crackled. Loud, sudden static, different from the usual interference that sometimes happens in rural areas. I instinctively reached for the mic, thinking dispatch was trying to talk to me. But there was no clear voice. Just irregular static, like someone trying to transmit and failing. In the middle of the static, I heard something. It wasn't clear, but it was clear enough to make me freeze. It was a whisper, very low, repeating numbers. At first, I thought it was my imagination trying to turn noise into pattern. But the numbers started to make sense. They were coordinates. Latitude and longitude in the standard format we use when receiving automatic location data. I memorized them while trying to adjust the volume. The whisper repeated once more and then disappeared, returning to normal static. I took a deep breath and began walking back to the cruiser, trying to keep my head cool. When I got inside and checked the cruiser's GPS system, I entered the coordinates I had heard. They matched exactly that stretch of road where the car was parked. At that point, I already had that uncomfortable feeling. Not panic, but not normal either. I tried contacting dispatch to confirm if anyone had transmitted coordinates recently. They said no. No nearby unit was using that channel at the time. I asked them to repeat whether any interference had been logged. Nothing. Clean line on their end. While I was talking on the radio, I noticed something else strange. The interior of the cruiser was too quiet, as if ambient sound had been dampened. I turned the radio off for a few seconds, then back on. Working normally, no static. It was as if it had only happened while I was standing at that specific point in the field. I went back to the abandoned car to check more details calmly. That's when I noticed something I had missed before. The driver's seat was pushed very far back, extremely far back. I'm 5'11", and I had to pull the seat forward to comfortably sit and check the dashboard. When I checked Daniel's ID again, I saw his recorded height was 5'6". It might seem like a small detail, but the seat position was adjusted for someone at least 4 to 6 inches taller than me. I tested the pedal distance. Even for me, it was almost at the limit of comfort. That didn't match someone his height driving normally. And the strangest part, there were no signs of a second set of footprints around the car. I began scanning the surroundings more carefully, widening my circle around the vehicle with the flashlight. If another person had left from there, there should have been another set of prints, even faint ones. But there was only that single trail heading into the cornfield. No marks from the passenger side, no marks behind the car, nothing. The dirt clearly showed what had been stepped on in the last few hours, so it made no sense that there was nothing else. I opened the trunk, empty except for a basic toolkit and a small fuel can, nothing indicating a struggle or hurried escape. I returned to the driver's side and stood there for a few seconds staring at the seat, trying to imagine the scene. If Daniel had stopped there alone, why was the seat in that position? And if someone else had been driving, where were their footprints? That's when the radio crackled again. This time I was beside the car, not in the field. The static was shorter but intense. I brought the mic to my mouth to call dispatch, but before I could speak, I heard the same whisper. The same coordinates. Repeated in the same low, almost emotionless tone. But this time, after the coordinates, there was something else. A short phrase almost swallowed by the interference. I didn't catch all of it, but it sounded like, "not alone." I stood there, literally feeling my blood run cold. It wasn't dispatch's voice. It wasn't the voice of any colleague I recognized. It was male, low, too close, like it was being transmitted from just a few meters away. When I tried to respond, the transmission had already stopped. I stood there for a few seconds holding the mic without saying anything, trying to decide if I had really heard it or if my mind was filling in gaps because of the silence and tension. Training teaches you not to react emotionally, so I forced a rational check. I verified the radio channel. Normal, no active transmission. I asked dispatch if anyone had tried to contact me in the last 30 seconds. They said no, that my unit had a clean signal and there was no logged traffic in that interval. My breathing was heavier than I'd like to admit. I scanned the road, shining the light across the cornfield, the other side of the road, the distant tree line. Nothing moved. No headlights in the distance, no engine sound. Just that dark field and the straight road disappearing into the night. I requested backup at that point. Not as an emergency, but as support for expanded search. While waiting, I decided to enter the cornfield one more time, now from the opposite side of where the footprints had stopped. I wanted to test whether someone could have circled around there without leaving visible marks. I walked a few meters in, maintaining visual contact with the cruiser. The smell of damp soil was stronger inside. As I moved forward, I began noticing something I hadn't seen before. Some plants were slightly bent in a direction different from the natural row pattern, as if something had passed sideways, but without enough weight on the ground to leave prints. It was too subtle to confirm. I crouched to examine it better and felt very clearly that I wasn't alone in there. I didn't hear a step. I didn't hear breathing, but I felt that presence too close, like someone was standing a few meters away, completely still, watching. I remained crouched for a few seconds, trying to hear anything that would confirm that sensation. My heart was beating hard enough that I could hear it in my ears. Turned off my flashlight for 2 seconds to listen better in the dark, which usually helps when you want to detect movement. It was a mistake. The instant the light went out, I clearly heard a quick shift among the plants to my left. It wasn't wind. There was no wind. It was the sound of someone stepping and pushing the corn aside, like someone changing position too quickly. I immediately turned the flashlight back on and aimed it where the sound had come from. Nothing. Just unmoving rows, as if nothing had been touched. I slowly backed out toward the edge of the field, keeping the light sweeping in a constant arc. When I returned near the road, the cruiser's headlights seemed too bright after the darkness. And that's when I noticed something else that made me go completely cold. The abandoned car was different. It hadn't moved from its position, but the driver's door was now closed. I am absolutely certain I had left that door open. It wasn't carelessness. I had been getting in and out to check things. The door was open when I entered the cornfield the second time. Now it was closed, perfectly aligned, as if someone had pushed it until the final click. I stood there staring at it for a few seconds, trying to decide if my memory was failing. It may seem small, but in that context it wasn't. I walked slowly to the car, pulled the handle, and opened it again. The interior was the same. Wallet on the passenger seat, cell phone in the console, keys in the ignition. But the driver's seat was pushed back even farther than before. Not much, maybe an inch or two, but enough for me to notice when I tried to sit and had to adjust it forward again. And at that moment, as I looked through the windshield toward the dark cornfield, I had the clear sensation that someone was standing inside it, tall enough to look over the tops of the plants, completely still, waiting for me to look back. Story 3. I'm 38 years old and have been a police officer in Seattle for a little over 12 years. I mostly work the night shift, mainly in the downtown area and the surrounding residential neighborhoods. Anyone who has worked patrol knows that welfare checks are common. A worried neighbor, a family member who isn't answering the phone, a strange smell in the hallway. Most of the time it's an elderly person who fell, someone sick, or even a dead animal. That night it was a little after 10 p.m. when dispatch sent us to a 3-story residential building in Capitol Hill. 2 residents had called complaining about a strong smell coming from an apartment on the 3rd floor. It wasn't a typical trash smell. According to them, it was heavier, sweeter, nauseating. The resident of the apartment hadn't been seen in a few days. The building was old, exposed brick, narrow internal staircase. The smell became noticeable by the 2nd flight of stairs. It wasn't unbearable, but it was there. Not coming in waves. Constant. Something that sat at the back of your throat. I knocked on the door of apartment 3C several times and announced our presence. No response. I rang the doorbell. Nothing. I tested the handle. Locked. I asked the building manager to bring the master key, but she informed us that that unit had been modified with an additional interior lock, the kind that can only be opened from inside when the latch is engaged. After several minutes trying to make contact without success and with supervisory authorization, we decided to force entry. We used the small battering ram kept in the cruiser for situations like this. It wasn't a dramatic explosion, just 2 firm impacts until the lock structure gave way. What caught my attention immediately was the interior latch still engaged when the door opened. It had truly been locked from the inside. It wasn't just a turned key. It was that additional security mechanism that can only be activated from inside. That made the situation strange even before I stepped in. The smell became slightly stronger when the door opened, but not at the level I would expect if there were a decomposing body inside. It was something different, hard to define. No flies, nothing visually wrong at first glance. The apartment was extremely organized. Clean living room, couch aligned, television off, nothing out of place. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no visible stains on the floor or walls. The kitchen was clean, sink free of dishes. A mug sat on the counter with dried coffee residue at the bottom. Nothing indicated haste or conflict. If someone had left, it seemed like they had left calmly. I began moving through the space carefully, checking behind doors, inside closets, and standard procedure. The smell seemed stronger toward the hallway leading to the bedroom and bathroom. It wasn't a smell that screamed body, but it definitely wasn't normal. The bedroom was at the end of the hallway, door slightly ajar. When I pushed it open slowly, the first thing I saw was an open suitcase on the bed. Not tossed, not rummaged through. Open as if someone was in the middle of packing for a trip. Clothes folded neatly on one side, some still stacked in small piles. A toiletry bag open with hygiene items already separated. Next to the bed, a pair of shoes aligned on the floor. Nothing scattered. Nothing indicating violent interruption. The bedroom window, the only window in the apartment, was completely closed. I tested the latch, locked from inside, curtains halfway drawn. There was no balcony, no external fire escape on that side of the building. It was a 3rd floor with smooth wall down to the ground. I entered the bathroom next, expecting to find some explanation there. The space was small, typical of old apartments. Towel properly hung on the rack. Sink clean. Mirror without recent hand marks. Toilet lid closed. When I approached the shower, I noticed something that made me stop. The glass was slightly fogged at the bottom, as if it had dried recently. I touched the shower handle. It was off. I ran my fingers along the ceramic tile inside the shower. It was still damp. Not soaked, but definitely damp. The kind of moisture that doesn't last for hours. The shower floor was also slightly wet. Not enough to form a puddle, but enough to leave the surface cool and slick. I looked at my partner and he confirmed with a slight nod. It wasn't my imagination. At that moment, the timeline started to feel strange in my head. If the shower had been used recently, then someone had been there shortly before we arrived. The smell in the hallway didn't match a recent shower, but it also wasn't strong enough to indicate something hidden in advanced decomposition. I returned to the living room and asked dispatch to try calling the resident while we checked the name on the building mailbox. The resident's cell phone rang. We heard the sound coming from inside the apartment. Not from the bedroom, not from the bathroom. It came from the kitchen, a normal ringtone loud enough to echo in the silent space. I walked to the kitchen and found the phone on the small table near the window. Screen lit up, dispatch's call displayed. The owner's name, Ethan Mallory, was confirmed in the lease records. I answered the phone right there. The operator hung up when she realized we were inside the unit. I quickly checked the call history. The last call had been 2 days earlier, to a number saved as Mom. No activity since then. Battery still at 62%. No signs that the device had been abandoned for long. It looked simply left behind. I ended the call and the heavy silence filled the apartment again. I went back to the hallway, trying to organize the information. Door locked from inside. Window closed and latched. No other exit. Shower damp as if recently used. Cell phone left behind. Suitcase open as if someone was in the middle of preparing to leave. None of it made sense together. My partner started checking the bedroom walls, tapping lightly to detect possible false spaces or hidden access. Nothing sounded hollow. The building was old but structurally solid. I opened the closet again. Clothes hanging normally. No hidden space. No duct large enough for someone to pass through. No ceiling hatch. The ceiling was continuous. The smell seemed concentrated in the hallway between the bedroom and bathroom. Not strong enough to indicate a body hidden there, but present. I crouched down and began examining the baseboards, looking for any sign of seepage or leak that could explain the odor. Nothing. The floor was dry. No dark stain. I stood up and, on impulse, closed the bathroom door completely to test something. When I did, the smell seemed to lessen slightly, not disappear but soften. I opened it again and it became more noticeable. It wasn't imagination. It was coming from there, but the bathroom was empty. Completely empty. I stepped back into the bathroom, this time closing the door behind me to isolate the smell. I stood still for a few seconds, just breathing through my nose, trying to identify the exact source. It wasn't coming from the sink drain, not from the toilet. When I approached the shower again, the odor felt stronger inside it. It wasn't a typical mold or sewage smell. It was something more organic, but very subtle. I knelt down and ran my hand over the shower drain. Visually clean, no hair buildup, no visible grime. But when I brought my face closer, the smell came from there. Not strong, but constant, as if something had passed through recently. I asked my partner to bring a stronger flashlight from the cruiser. While he went downstairs, I remained alone in the apartment for a few minutes. It was during that interval that I heard something that still bothers me to remember, a short muffled sound from the bedroom. Not loud. It sounded like fabric being pulled or adjusted on the bed. I left the bathroom immediately and went to the bedroom. The suitcase was still open. Clothes in the same place. But one of the shirts folded near the edge looked slightly displaced, as if it had slipped a few inches. It could have been vibration from when we forced the door. It could have been my impression. But at that moment, alone inside that apartment, it didn't feel like coincidence. I stood there in the bedroom for a few seconds, staring at the suitcase as if it might give me an answer. My partner was still coming down the stairs when I heard another sound, this time clearer. A click from the bathroom like metal against ceramic. Not loud, but distinct. I went back quickly. The shower was exactly as before, except now a drop was forming at the tip of the faucet. I am certain there had been no dripping when I touched it minutes earlier. The drop fell and made a small sound on the shower floor. Nothing else happened. I touched the interior wall again. Still damp. It wasn't drying at the speed it should have for that time of night and with the minimal ventilation the bathroom had. When my partner returned with the stronger flashlight, we illuminated the shower drain more carefully. A few centimeters down the pipe, there appeared to be something dark, not clearly identifiable. It could have been shadow. It could have been accumulated debris. But the smell came from there. We called building maintenance to shut off the apartment's water before any more invasive inspection. While we waited, I stood in the hallway looking at the broken entry door. The interior latch was still hanging, broken by the force of the impact. It had definitely been engaged when we entered. There was no way someone could have left after that without passing us. And even before, there was no possible exit route. No body was found that night. No sign of struggle. No structural explanation for the odor. The owner, Ethan Mallory, was officially declared missing weeks later. What stayed with me wasn't just the damp shower. It was the clear sensation that we had arrived minutes too late. As if someone had taken a shower, started packing a suitcase, and simply stopped being there. Not evaporated, not escaped through the window, just no longer present in a space that had been completely locked from the inside. Story 4. I am 36 years old and work as a police officer in a mid-sized city in Arizona near Phoenix. At that time, my shift was from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., and one of the most common tasks after 10 p.m. was patrolling commercial areas that were already closed: shopping centers, large supermarkets, department store parking lots, mostly to prevent vandalism and break-ins more than anything else. It was an ordinary Tuesday, a little after 11:30 p.m., still hot even at night because the asphalt here holds heat all day. The mall was completely closed, metal gates down, exterior lighting partially on. It wasn't unusual to find a lone car in the parking lot, an employee leaving late or someone waiting for another person. But that night the parking lot was practically empty. I was driving slowly between the rows when I saw something move near one of the farthest lamps from the main entrance. At first I thought it was a plastic bag being dragged by the wind, but when my headlights got closer I realized it was a child, a little girl apparently around 5 years old, maybe 6 at most. She was walking alone in the middle of the parking lot, far from the sidewalk, far from the entrance. She was wearing a light-colored dress and sandals. She didn't look dirty, didn't look injured. She was simply walking slowly as if looking for something. My first thought was abandonment or a child who had gotten lost inside the mall and somehow came out after closing. I stopped the cruiser immediately and got out. I approached slowly so I wouldn't scare her. She didn't run, didn't show fear. She only turned her face toward me when I said, "Hey, are you okay?" Her face was completely calm. No crying, no heavy breathing, nothing that indicated panic. That alone was strange because any child that age alone in a dark parking lot at night would at least be confused. I asked where her parents were. She answered simply, almost automatically, "My dad is over there." Her voice was low but firm. It didn't sound rehearsed, but it also didn't sound hesitant. I asked where exactly. She raised her arm and pointed toward a more distant row of the parking lot, where the lighting was weaker and a few cars were parked far from the main entrance. I looked in the direction she indicated. There were maybe 4 or 5 vehicles scattered there, all apparently closed. None with headlights on, none with doors open. I asked which car was her father's. She didn't answer. She just kept pointing in the same direction. I knelt down to be at her eye level and asked her name. She didn't respond. She just repeated, "He's over there." The way she spoke wasn't frightened. It was too neutral. I asked over the radio for dispatch to check if there had been any recent report of a missing child in that area. While waiting for a response, I told her to stay by my side while we went over to the cars to check. We began walking toward the row she had pointed to. I walked slowly, keeping her on my left side, slightly behind me, the way I do when escorting someone. The parking lot was large, and as we moved farther from the main entrance, the lighting became more spaced out. The asphalt was still warm from the day. You could feel the heat rising through my boots. The silence was almost total, just the distant hum of the tall lamps. I looked back once to confirm she was still there. She was, walking calmly, unhurried, not asking questions. That bothered me more than if she had been crying. When we reached the first row of cars, I began checking them one by one with my flashlight. All locked, tinted windows but no one visible inside. I discreetly tested one of the handles, locked. No sign of someone hiding in the back seat. I asked again which car was her father's. No response. I turned around to speak to her, maybe to ask her father's name, maybe to confirm if he was inside one of those vehicles. And she wasn't there anymore. She wasn't behind me. She wasn't beside me. She wasn't between the cars. At first I thought she had walked around one of the cars, maybe playing or hiding. I took 2 steps back and illuminated 360 degrees around me. Nothing. There wasn't enough space between the vehicles for someone her height to disappear without making noise. The parking lot was open, flat, without large obstacles. If she had run, I would have heard the sound of sandals on asphalt. I called out in a controlled tone, "Hey, come back here." No response. Just the faint echo of my own voice reflecting off the surrounding buildings. My chest tightened at that moment. Not because of anything supernatural, but because a small child disappearing like that doesn't make physical sense. I immediately walked quickly back toward the cruiser, illuminating the path, looking for any low movement in my field of vision. As I walked, I called over the radio requesting immediate backup for a possible missing child in the mall parking lot. Dispatch responded asking for a detailed description. I gave everything. Female, approximately 5 years old, light dress, sandals, shoulder-length hair. I asked if there had been any call about a missing child that night. The response came back negative. No record, no related report. I stopped in the middle of the parking lot and slowly turned with the flashlight on. There was no one walking, no car starting, no adult running desperately looking for a daughter. I began mentally reviewing every second since I saw her. She was there when I got out of the cruiser. She walked beside me to the row of cars. There was no major distraction that would justify losing someone that height from my field of vision. The parking lot was too open to allow a child to disappear behind something without me noticing. Even if she had run, she would have had to cross a lit area before reaching any truly dark spot. And I heard nothing. No accelerated footsteps, no laughter, no crying. Just the hum of the lamps and the distant sound of the building's air conditioning. The other units arrived within minutes. We conducted a full sweep of the parking lot, including behind decorative shrubs near the entrance. Nothing. We checked the mall's exterior doors to make sure no one had re-entered the building. All locked. The security manager was called to open the camera monitoring room. While waiting for access to the footage, I stood looking at the area where she had disappeared. The heat of the asphalt was beginning to fade, and for the first time I felt a slight chill in my arms even though the temperature was still high. It wasn't the weather. It was the situation. We entered the monitoring room about 20 minutes later. The security officer pulled the recordings from the external cameras that covered exactly the area where I had been. I stood next to the monitor, arms crossed, waiting to clearly see the little girl appear in the footage. The recording showed my cruiser entering the parking lot, stopping near the lamp where I had seen her. It showed me getting out of the car. It showed me walking a few meters forward, alone. I asked to rewind. We played it again, slower. At no moment did a child appear beside me. I walked toward the row of cars as if speaking to someone, but there was no one there. The next clip showed me reaching the cars, illuminating them with the flashlight, turning my head as if responding to someone on my left. But the space next to me was empty the entire time. There was no glitch in the image, no cut, no blind spot in that area. The camera had a wide angle covering the entire path. I felt a physical discomfort watching that. It wasn't just confusion. It was the sensation of being certain of something that simply wasn't recorded. The security guard asked if I was okay, because I stood staring at the screen for too long. I said I was. No adult reported a missing child that night. No later calls. No records in regional hospitals. We filed an internal report and attached the footage. Officially, the incident was logged as negative verification after visual report not confirmed by cameras. But what stayed with me was her naturalness. The calm way she said, "My dad is over there," and the fact that in the recordings I walked alone the entire time, pointing at empty cars as if accompanying someone who simply wasn't there. Story 5. I am 42 years old and work as a police officer in a small town in rural Pennsylvania. It's not the kind of town that makes national news. It's mostly farmland, a few residential streets, a 24-hour gas station, and a diner that closes at 10 at night. At that time, my shift was from midnight to 8 a.m. Overnight, there's usually too quiet. At 2 in the morning, it's normally just trucks passing on the state highway and, occasionally, a resident coming home late. That night was cold, the typical damp cold of the region with a light fog starting to form near the fields. I was driving slowly down Main Street when I saw a man walking in the middle of the road, not on the sidewalk, right in the middle of the street. He didn't look drunk. He wasn't staggering. He was walking straight but in a rigid way, arms tight against his body, as if he were overly focused on each step. I slowed down and stopped beside him. Before I could say anything, he turned to me with wide eyes and said, "You need to arrest me." It wasn't a normal request. It wasn't, "Can I talk to you?" It was direct. His voice was shaky but clear. I asked what was going on. He replied immediately, "I can't go back home. If I go back, something bad will happen." He didn't seem intoxicated. No smell of alcohol, pupils normal. He was just visibly shaken. I asked him to step toward the cruiser and shined my flashlight on his face to observe him more closely. Nothing indicated drug or alcohol use. He was trembling, but not from the cold. It was an internal tremor visible in his jaw and hands. I asked for his name, address, whether anyone had threatened him, whether there had been a fight. He answered everything coherently. Name Patrick Nolan. Address 2 streets behind where we were. He said he had been at home lying down and that something wasn't right. When I asked what exactly, he paused for a few seconds and said, "I can't explain it. I just know I can't go back." He kept repeating that. He reported no crime, made no accusation, Nothing that justified an arrest. I explained that I can't arrest someone without legal cause. He then said, "Then take me there, you need to see." He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't shouting. It was almost a desperate request, but restrained. I asked how long he had been walking. He said for a while, but couldn't say how long. I glanced at the cruiser's clock. It was 2:17 a.m. The street was completely empty, no lights on in nearby houses. I decided to accompany him to the residence to check for any possible risk situation. At least that much I could do. He got into the back seat of the cruiser without resistance. I didn't cuff him because there was no legal reason, but I kept the doors locked per procedure. As we drove the 2 blocks to the address he gave, he stayed silent. I watched him in the rearview mirror. He was staring fixedly at his own reflection in the glass partition, as if trying to recognize his own face. I asked if anyone else lived with him. He said no. I asked if he had a history of sleepwalking, anxiety, anything like that. He said he had never had any issues. He worked at a local auto shop, normal routine, nothing out of the ordinary. His house was on a simple residential street, single-story homes with individual garages. When we parked in front, the first thing I noticed was that all the lights were off. No sign of movement inside. He swallowed hard when he saw his own house. I told him to stay behind me as we approached the door. The front door was unlocked. Not wide open, but unlocked. I turned the handle and it opened without resistance. He stood on the threshold, hesitating to enter. I announced our presence loudly. No response. I stepped in first, illuminating the living room with my flashlight. The air inside the house was normal. No strange smell, no sign of forced entry. Couch in place, television off, nothing out of the ordinary. The kitchen was dark but organized. Clean dishes in the sink, trash closed. There was no sign of struggle or intrusion. I asked him again what exactly had made him leave the house. He answered quietly, "I was in bed and then I was on the street." That made me pause for a second. I asked what he meant. He put a hand to his forehead and said he remembered lying down looking at the ceiling, feeling that something was wrong. And then he only remembered walking in the middle of the street. We went to his bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. When I pushed it open slowly, I saw that the bed was messy, as if someone had just gotten up. The blanket was partially pulled toward the floor. One pillow was in the middle of the mattress, indented as if it still held the shape of a head. By itself, that wasn't strange. What caught my attention was the faint blue light coming from the dresser. His cell phone was there, plugged into the charger. Screen dark, but charging. I looked at him immediately. I asked where his phone was. He instinctively put his hand in his pocket, and there was nothing. I picked up the phone from the dresser and showed it to him. I asked if that was his phone. He confirmed with a slow nod, but his expression completely changed at that moment. It wasn't just fear, it was real confusion. He started shaking his head and repeating, "I didn't take my phone." I asked if he had another device. He said no. The phone was clearly there, plugged into the charger as if it had been left before going to sleep. I tapped the screen. It showed 2:23 a.m., battery at 94%. The last recorded activity was at 11:48 p.m., a message to a coworker. Nothing after that. I asked him what time he thought he had left the house. He said he had no idea, but that when I found him, he had already been walking for a long time. I looked at the bed again. The sheet was still slightly warm when I touched it with my hand. Not too warm, but not completely cold like it should have been if he had been outside for over an hour in the cold night air. I asked if he had left through the front door. He said he didn't remember opening any door. He didn't remember putting on the shoes he was wearing. He looked down at his own feet as if seeing them for the first time. I asked him to sit on the edge of the bed while I checked the rest of the house again. I opened the hallway closet, checked the bathroom, verified the windows. All closed and locked from the inside. No sign of forced entry. The house was exactly as it should be if someone had gone to sleep normally. When I returned to the bedroom, he was sitting with his elbows on his knees, hands on his face, breathing irregularly. I asked if he had a history of fainting or memory loss episodes. He said nothing like this had ever happened. He said he clearly remembered lying down in bed. He remembered looking at the clock. After that, a blank. I asked what his last clear memory was before I found him on the street. He closed his eyes for a few seconds, trying to organize it. He said he remembered lying down, feeling that something was wrong inside the house, as if he wasn't alone. I asked if he had heard any noise. He said maybe a faint sound in the hallway, but he wasn't sure. He said he was afraid to look at the bedroom door. After that, he only remembered walking in the middle of the street and seeing my headlights approaching. He started crying right there, not dramatically, but a restrained cry from someone who truly doesn't understand what happened. I sat in the chair near the bed and tried to keep the conversation as rational as possible. I explained that episodes of sleepwalking can happen even in adults who have never had them before. I explained that sometimes the mind fills in gaps when a person wakes up already in motion. He listened but shook his head as if it didn't fit. He said he had never left the house while sleeping, had never been found outside the bedroom, nothing like that. I asked if he had taken any new medication. Negative. Drunk anything different? Negative. The cold from the street was still in his clothes, but his hands were too warm, as if he had left only minutes earlier. I asked him to show me the shoes he normally wears when going out. He pointed to a pair next to the bedroom door. They were there, untouched. I then asked which ones he had been wearing when I found him. He looked down at his feet again. They weren't the same. They were an older pair, which he said he didn't even remember having set aside. We went to the front entrance. The front door had no signs of forced entry. The handle was normal. What caught my attention was that the door had only been shut when we arrived. Not open but not locked. I asked if he usually locked the door before going to bed. He answered immediately that yes, always. I tested the front door lock several times. It worked normally. For someone to leave, they would have had to turn the handle, open it, cross the porch, and close it behind them. Nothing there indicated mechanical failure. I asked if he had close neighbors who might have seen anything. He said the houses next door usually go to sleep early, and no one is on the street at that hour. I looked at the clock again. It was already past 2:40 a.m. If he had been walking for at least an hour, as it seemed from the distance where I found him, that would place his departure around 1:30 or 1:40. The cell phone showed no activity after 11:48 p.m., no alarm triggered, no calls made. I returned to the bedroom one last time. The bed was still messy. The sheet was now cold to the touch. The cell phone continued charging on the dresser. That was the point I couldn't make fit. If he had woken up frightened and decided to leave, why would he leave the phone charging? He didn't seem like the type of person who would leave the house in the middle of the night without a phone. Asked if he remembered hearing someone in the house before leaving. He started crying again and said he had the feeling that someone was standing in the hallway, just outside the line of sight of the bedroom door. He said he was afraid to look directly. He said that in his memory he never got out of bed. Legally, I had no reason to detain him. There was no crime, no confirmed intrusion, no sign of violence. I suggested he spend the night at a friend's or family member's house and seek medical attention in the morning to evaluate a possible dissociative episode or sleepwalking. He agreed, but before leaving, he stopped at the door and asked something I didn't know how to answer. He asked how someone can leave the house, cross 2 streets, walk for at least an hour, and not remember even opening their own door. I had no technical answer for that. To this day, when I drive down that street during the overnight shift, I remember the look on his face when he saw his own phone still charging beside the bed. Story 6. I have worked as a police officer for 11 years in a small town in rural Oregon. It's not one of those mountain tourist towns. It's more rural area, lots of timber, old houses scattered along long, quiet streets. At that time, I was part of the night patrol, a shift that starts at 10 p.m. and runs until 6 a.m. Dispatch here is small, 3 operators per shift, and we all know each other by name. During one particular week, something strange started happening. Always at 3:17 a.m., exactly the same minute, dispatch would receive a call from a residence in the oldest part of town. When they answered, there was no response. Just an open line for a few seconds, and then it would disconnect. The first time they treated it as a line error, the second as a possible accidental dial. But by the 4th occurrence in the same week, all at the exact same time, they decided to send a unit. That night, by coincidence, I was closest to the area. When the clock hit 3:17 and dispatch's phone rang again with the same address. The operator answered, 911, what's your emergency? And there was silence on the other end. I was already driving toward the location while she attempted contact. The house belonged to an elderly woman named Margaret Ellis, 82 years old, a widow, living alone there for decades. The street she lived on was old, wooden houses built in the 1950s, tall trees blocking part of the street lighting. When I parked in front, the house was completely dark. No lights on, no television on, nothing indicating recent activity. It was a cold early morning, and the air carried that damp wood smell common in the region. I knocked on the door several times before announcing my presence. It took almost a full minute before I heard slow footsteps approaching from inside. She opened the door using the security chain first, then fully unlocked it when she saw the uniform. Margaret looked confused but not alarmed. White hair pulled back, thick robe over pajamas. I asked if everything was all right and explained that dispatch had received a call from her line at exactly 3:17. She frowned and said she had been sleeping deeply. Said she hadn't touched the phone that night. I asked if anyone else had access to the house. She said no. No family lived nearby. No nighttime caregiver. The house was too quiet as we spoke. That kind of silence where every creak of wood feels amplified. I asked permission to step inside and quickly check whether there was an issue with the phone or a possible accidental trigger. She agreed, still half asleep but visibly uncomfortable with the idea that something had happened while she slept. The living room was simple. Old furniture, worn rug, television off. The landline phone sat on a small table beside the main armchair. It was one of those older models with a coiled cord and heavy base. I approached and checked for any stuck buttons. Nothing unusual. The handset was properly on the hook. I asked if she had any history of sleepwalking or if she might have gotten up without realizing it. She said nothing like that had ever happened. While we talked, I noticed the phone cord didn't go directly down to the wall as it normally would. Instead, it ran along the side, secured with old staples, then went upward toward the ceiling, passing through a small opening that led into the attic. That wasn't as common in newer installations, but the house was old, so it wasn't impossible. I asked if she had done any recent maintenance on the line. She said she hadn't been in the attic in years. Said she could barely climb the folding ladder that gave access up there. I asked her to remain in the living room while I quickly checked the attic. The retractable ladder was in the hallway near the bathroom. I pulled the cord, and the ladder dropped with that dry sound of old wood unfolding. The air that came down from above was colder and carried a strong smell of accumulated dust. I climbed slowly, flashlight clipped to my vest, careful with each step. The attic wasn't tall enough to stand fully upright. Old insulation spread between beams, boxes stored for decades, nothing apparently out of place. But the phone wire was there, crossing the space until disappearing through a hole in the wood on the opposite side. I followed the cable with my flashlight until I found a section that made me stop. Part of the plastic insulation was stripped. Not completely cut, but scraped enough to expose the internal copper. It didn't look like natural wear. The cut was irregular but recent. The plastic around it was lighter in color than the rest of the aged wire. Additionally, the cable had been slightly repositioned, as if it had been moved a few centimeters away from the beam where it was normally secured. I carefully touched the exposed section. It wasn't warm, but it also didn't have decades of dust like the rest of the attic. At that moment, my first reaction was to think of outside interference. Someone could access the line through the attic without entering through the front door. The house was old, but the windows were locked and there were no signs of forced entry. I examined the surrounding area for any signs someone had been there recently. The dust in the insulation showed subtle marks, as if someone had placed a knee or hand at a specific point near the wire. They weren't clear footprints, but they were interruptions in the uniform layer of dust that builds up over years. I turned off my radio for a moment to listen more closely. The attic was too quiet except for the faint sound of wood adjusting to the cold night air. I went back down and explained to Margaret that the wire appeared to have been manipulated recently. She turned pale. She said no one had authorization to touch the house. I asked if she had heard any strange noises during the week. She thought for a few seconds and said that on 2 nights she had woken up with the feeling that someone was walking on the roof. Not heavy footsteps, but light scratching sounds like something dragging. She had ignored it, assuming it was a tree branch or an animal. The detail was that the house didn't have trees close enough to touch the roof. And the roof was sloped. Difficult for someone to stay up there without equipment. I asked her to describe the sounds better. She said it always happened around the same time, shortly before she woke up startled. She didn't look at the clock, but when I mentioned 3:17, she seemed to grow more tense. She said she usually woke up feeling like something had interrupted her sleep, but she couldn't explain what. I asked whether the phone was near her bedroom. She said no, the landline was only in the living room. Her bedroom was at the end of the hallway. far enough that she wouldn't accidentally bump the phone without noticing. I examined the phone more carefully. No stuck buttons, no visible short circuit, but the stripped wire in the attic meant someone could be manipulating the line directly. In older systems, it's possible to generate a call by creating contact between wires. That's not something someone does accidentally. That's intentional. I asked if anyone had reason to intimidate her or pressure her into selling the house. She said she had refused a few purchase offers from local investors in recent months. Nothing aggressive but persistent. I mentally noted that. I stepped outside to circle the house, shining my flashlight along the wall near where the wire entered the attic. The house had old wooden siding, with areas where the paint was peeling. There was no ladder leaning against it, no obvious ground marks indicating someone had climbed recently. But as I illuminated the side, I noticed something small that almost went unnoticed. 2 recent screws securing a discrete piece of metal along the edge of the roof, as if someone had created a foothold. It wasn't flashy, but it didn't match the rest of the house's aged structure. I went back inside and explained that we might need to involve the phone company to inspect the external line at dawn. She agreed, clearly shaken. I was about to close out the call when my radio crackled. I looked at the clock. 3:20 exactly. Dispatch was calling again, the same address, but I was inside the house. The landline in the living room hadn't rung. The operator said the line was active at that moment. I looked at the phone. It was on the hook, motionless. The silence inside the living room was absolute. I picked up the handset and held it to my ear. No one was speaking, but I could hear the open line. A very faint sound, almost a constant background hum. I said, "This is the police. Who is on the line?" Nothing. Dispatch confirmed the call was still active in their system. I unplugged the phone from the wall. The operator said the call dropped immediately. That meant the contact was coming from that physical line, not from any external system redirection. I felt that tension rise through my body. Someone was interfering directly with the wire. I went back up to the attic almost automatically, as if expecting to catch someone there. The air felt heavier now, or maybe it was just my breathing speeding up. My flashlight illuminated the same section of stripped wire, but there was a difference. The exposed copper was now slightly bent, as if it had been pressed seconds earlier. It hadn't looked like that when I examined it before. I am certain of that. There was no one visible in the attic. No space large enough for someone to hide beyond the beams and insulation. But the dust near the wire had been disturbed again. A new mark and too fresh. That night we found no one. There was no direct evidence of forced entry through the front door. The phone company was called the next day and confirmed that someone had been physically manipulating the line before the internal entry point, but they couldn't determine exactly from where. The question that stayed with me wasn't only how someone accessed the wire without being seen. It was why someone would repeatedly call the police, always at the same minute, and never say anything. It didn't feel like a request for help. It felt like a test, as if whoever was on the other end wanted to confirm how long it took us to arrive, but never wanted to be found.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.